According to the Congressional Research Center, out of the 535 members of Congress, 460 claim to be Christians. That's nearly 4 out of every 5 who claim to be Christians. Now you may be wondering, if there's so many Christians in Congress, then why don't we see them legislating like Christians more often? In these next few minutes, I'm going to give you guys 3 ways in which Christians who are politicians can and must defend God's values. The first way in which Christians can and must defend God's values is by the use of diplomacy. An example of this was when Pastor Yusuf from Iran was imprisoned. In early 2012, after his imprisonment, congressmen and senators alike worked together to get his release. Later in 2012, in October, Pastor Yusuf was released. However, less than 3 months later, on December 25th, 2012, Pastor Yusuf was once again imprisoned. Since then, Congressman Joe Pitts from Pennsylvania, an evangelical Christian, has been working tirelessly towards his release. After passing a bill through Congress demanding that Iran release Pastor Yusuf immediately, we can only wait and pray to see what happens. This is especially effective because, number one, nations do not like to have trade restrictions imposed on them, and secondly, they do not want the relations strained between us and them. The second way in which Christian politicians can and must defend God's values is by speaking out. President George W. Bush once said, "The promises of our Declaration of Independence are not just for the strong, the independent, or the healthy. They are for everyone, including unborn children." Ronald Reagan also said, "I've noticed that everyone who's for abortion has already been born." Statements like these from previous politicians not only carry a greater weight among the country, but they also can be used to sway the public opinion. Because of their public spotlight, they hold an especially great advantage at swaying the public opinion. The third way in which Christian politicians can and must defend God's values is by legislating. Out of the 535 congressmen, 281 legislated with a 75% higher pro-life record, according to the National Right to Life Commission. This included cutting off federal spending to Planned Parenthood, the #1 abortion provider in the United States, according to the New York Times. This also included cutting off funding by taxpayers for abortions. An example of this also was in 2003, when George W. Bush in Congress passed the partial birth abortion ban. This had been something that conservatives and Christians had been working to have a ban in place since the early 1980s. In 1997 and 1996, Congress passed 2 bills that would effectively ban partial birth abortions. However, on both occasions, President Bill Clinton vetoed the bills. After Congress and President George W. Bush passed the ban in 2003, the Supreme Court decided to challenge the ruling. However, in 2007, after deciding the bill was constitutional, they upheld the law. This was a great win for conservatives and pro-lifers, because life had won. In these past few minutes, I've shown you 3 ways in which Christian politicians can and must defend God's values. We saw how diplomacy is working in Iran, how Congress is using diplomacy to work towards Pastor Yusuf's release. We saw how previous presidents used their speaking and public spotlight to sway public opinion. And we saw how legislators on Capitol Hill were able to effectively pass a bill that would ban partial birth abortions. If our nation didn't have Christian politicians, our world and nation would be a much worse place. The Bible states in Psalm 82, verse 3, "Defend the poor and fatherless, do justice to the afflicted and needy." And politicians can certainly practice this too.